Welcome to Building EDH Decks on a Budget. So a lot of people ask me when they see the various EDH deck guides going up on the channel, they say, do you really expect me to pay X amount for this deck, where X is multiple thousands of dollars? So I wanted to respond to that and explain my thinking behind a lot of this stuff. So when I build these decks, I build them to be the highest power possible usually, even if they're not an out-and-out CEDH deck, because I feel that it's easier to downgrade a higher power deck to the appropriate power level for your play group than it is to fill in the holes of a low power deck, upgrading it into a higher power one. But being a high power deck, it means that we are going to run all of the best, most optimal cards regardless of how much they cost. So let's take a look at a typical super powerful high level CEDH deck, a deck like Thrasios and Tymna. So this deck is, of course, 4 different colors. It's going to be running revised dual lands. It's going to be running all the most expensive cards. And as you can see down here, Moxfield says that the deck is worth about $6,500. So before we get to the deck itself, I want to say I always recommend using proxies. First of all, it is just not reasonable to expect people to be able to play the most expensive cards in the game. Cards like Gaia's Cradle, Time Twister, Mox Diamond, these cards that are worth multiple hundreds or even in the thousands of dollars. And it seems to be generally accepted among the CEDH community that proxies are not only okay, but encouraged. A lot of people, myself included, will say, when I play against another player, I want to play against the player, not their wallet. The second thing is that EDH is, in general, a casual, for fun format and does not take place in tournaments that have paid entry fees and prizes. Now, there obviously are exceptions. There are organizers that put together tournament EDH, but for the most part, this is played by groups of friends and casuals at local game stores just to have fun. And in that regard, there is no reason or obligation on your part to not use proxies. In all my times playing the game, in 14 years, I've only ever encountered one player who had a problem with me using proxies, and even then, they didn't refuse to play the game. Now, if you are playing with people who refuse to play with you because you're using proxies, or your LGS does not allow proxies, find another play group or store to play at. These people are jerks. But with that said, a lot of people just don't like using proxies. They prefer the look, the feel of real cards, or just they like to have and own the real card and not to have a proxy of it. So what would I say to those people? Well, in a lot of cases, for example, in this Thrasios Tymna deck that costs allegedly $6,500, in a lot of cases, the bulk of this price tag actually comes from only a handful of cards in the deck. So let's split this up into the actual price and break it down card by card. So when you look at the deck in its entirety, broken down by price, with the most expensive cards coming from over here, as you can see, so most expensive card, Underground Sea. Then we have Mox Diamond, Tropical Island, Tundra, Bayou, Savannah, Scrubland. So these are all revised dual lands, and by no means do you need to play these in your deck. You can, of course, replace them with shock lands or just any other dual lands that you want. And this is going to be the case in basically every multicolor deck, which is that the dual lands are going to be the most expensive cards. Then we've got some other reserve list or just really expensive cards like Survival of the Fittest, Gilded Drake, Imperial Seal, Chrome Mox, and again, these are cards that you don't really need. Like, yes, Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox, these are obviously very powerful. I would run them in basically every single EDH deck, but if you're really concerned over the price, you don't have to play these cards. Force of Will, another card that you don't have to play. You could replace this with just some other counterspell. Gemstone Caverns is a land that I include in essentially every single EDH deck, but you don't have to play it. Again, if you're concerned about budget and your play group or just the general atmosphere of whatever LGS you go to doesn't have decks that are of that high power level and you're not really needing to compete on this front, you can cut a lot of these cards. For example, if we just cut every single card that's worth over $100 from this deck, we already reduced the price all the way down to $1,550, which is still admittedly a lot, but it's a lot less than what it was before. And you can continue this process for many of the cards in the deck. Most decks are not going to need a Vampiric Tutor. They're not going to need a Boseiju. You can continue this on down the line and get the deck into a much more manageable position financially speaking. Now, with that said, however, it's still very difficult to get decks down to an actual, what most players would consider budget level. I've asked my viewers before what amount of money they consider budget, and the general consensus was that anywhere around sub $250 or the majority opinion under $100. And for getting to that cheap, your options are going to be severely restricted as to what you can play. After all, a lot of the reason that these cards are expensive is because they're popular in EDH, and they're popular in EDH because they're good in EDH. So as an example, let's take a look at Selvala Heart of the Wild's budget. So I've tried to build certain quote-unquote budget decks, and this is a version of Selvala Heart of the Wilds, which is a CEDH playable commander that's built, in this case, I couldn't get it under 280. As a point of reference, the Selvala Heart of the Wilds deck that is non-budget is listed at 3,000. Now, the bulk of that is Gaia's Cradle, to be fair. But also to be fair, Gaia's Cradle is pretty important for the deck. So if we look at this budget version, it's still mostly doing what Selvala is trying to do. It still has its tutors and its ramp. It still has a bunch of untapping effects for Selvala, a bunch of card draw, a bunch of big creatures, and pump effect, and protection for Selvala. But it's a lot less, a lot worse, a lot less efficient than the non-budget version. For example, in this regard, I had to cut most of the lands down to just basic forest. A lot of the costs for EDH decks do come down to the lands, and that's why when you're building on a budget, it often means that you can't be more than one color, because once you start getting into dual color lands, the price explodes. So let's compare the budget version of the deck with the non-budget version and see what I had to slash out of it in order to get it down to this cheap. So cuts from the deck. I cut Bridgeworks Battle, Sanctum Weaver, Nykthos, Gemstone Caverns, Benefactor's Draught, Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, Disciple of Freyalise, Mox Diamond, Yavimaya, Cavern of Souls, Fanatic of Ronus, Phyrexian Dreadnought, Season of Gathering, Beseiju, Command Beacon, Last March of the Ents, Instill Energy, Gaia's Cradle, Finale of Devastation, Lotus Petal, Incubation Druid, Allosaur Shepherd, Turntimber Symbiosis, Legolas Quick Reflexes, and Concordant Crossroads. And replaced them with these cards, as you can see here, which again are not bad. They do work in the deck, but they're a lot worse. And as you can see, plus 13 forests. And this was cutting the most I could out of the deck. I still couldn't really get it down to sub 250 and have the deck still be functional. But if you look through the rest of the deck here, most of the cards are not that expensive. And the expensive cards wind up just being Green Sun Zenith, Umbral Mantle, Veil of Summer, Birds, Natural Order, Delighted Halfling, Skull Clamp, Cloudstone Curio, and Ashaya. And then most of the other cards are not too bad, but it does add up. Similarly, let's look at Krenko Mob Boss on a budget versus non-budget. So non-budget, again, I could just barely not get below the 250 mark going to budget. And on non-budget, the deck is listed as 2,650. So while I did manage to cut out over $2,000 worth of cards, I couldn't get it to any lower than 250 before it stopped being functional. And pointing out once again that we wound up with a monocolor deck instead of a multicolor deck. So here, 29 mountains and 1 war room. Not a lot of options in the mono base if you want the deck on a budget. So once again, if we compare, the cards that I wound up cutting from the non-budget deck in order to get to the budget deck were Treasonous Ogre, Nykthos, Gemstone Caverns, Ancient Tomb, Battle Hymn, Chrome Mox, Ruby Medallion, Tybalt Trickery, Mox Diamond, Thousand Year Elixir, Muxus, Mana Echoes, Cavern of Souls, Ragavan, Goblin Lackey, Mox Opal, Great Furnace, 3 Street City, Hall the Bandit Lord, Command Beacon, Mog Catcher, Urza Saga, The One Ring, Brightstone Ritual, Monovault, Jessica's Will, Lotus Petal, Deflecting Swat, Cloudstone Curio, Professional Facebreaker, Arena of Glory, Dockside, which is now banned, Grim Monolith, and Trinisphere. And then if we look at the cards that are built for the budget version, there's some that make some sense, like some additional Mono Rocks, some additional things that grant haste, but there's also a lot of kind of iffy choices like Burnout, that kind of stuff. Like the cards are not bad, but you can see what we're replacing, and we upped 10 mountains by cutting a bunch of other lands. One of the other things to be noted, of course, is that when you start cutting cards like Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox, you kind of have to increase the amount of ramp or lands that you're playing. So this is why I highly advocate for proxies. Highly advocate for proxies. Because once you do not accept proxies and you start trying to budget your way down, you start having to strip out not only the cards that make the deck good, but also a lot of times the cards that make the deck unique and fun. So the only PSA I would give about proxies is let's talk about what are acceptable proxies and what are not acceptable ones. In this case, we're going to use Ragavan as the example. So first, we have a piece of paper that has been color printed from a printer and slipped into a sleeve with a regular card backing it. Now, it's technically a little bit thicker than a regular card, but you basically can't tell the difference. This is fine. It looks like the card. Maybe you can tell it's a proxy, particularly if you don't have the rounded edges and you just print it straight without cutting them with scissors. But for the most part, It looks like the regular card. It has all of the relevant information, including the artwork, so that it's easily identifiable across the table. The next version of the proxy is the black and white proxy that has no artwork on it. Now, this one is a lot worse. It technically still has all of the relevant information that you need to know. The card type, how much it costs, what the text says. But the problem here is that there is no artwork on it and no color on it. So it is very difficult to tell what this card is across the table, and it gets worse if you have more cards that are proxied like this. So the one exception that I'll make here is if this is the only proxy in your entire deck, then you can just say, oh, I have a proxy, it's X card, and then I can probably remember what that card is. But if you have multiple cards, especially permanents, that are in play, and they all kind of look like this, they're all the same black and white, no artwork cards, it's going to be really difficult for me to tell what the heck this card is. And remember, you're looking at this dead on zoomed in. It might be fine looking like this, but what about when it looks like this? So remember, you're looking at it across the table, it's upside down, at an angle, far away, at the other side of the table. So remember, the card looks more like this across the table. I have no idea what this is. I can't tell what this card is. This is why this is not an acceptable version of a proxy. And then the last one is the basic land or whatever card it is, sharpied to just say what the card is. This is the worst version of a proxy. Not only does it not have the relevant information on it, so you have to remember what it does, but it also has artwork that's not only not the artwork of the card, it has artwork of a different card. So again, if you're going to make proxies, do this one. Print out the actual card on a color printer. And if you don't own a color printer, go to a Kinko's or something and print it out from there. But anyways, that has been my breakdown and PSAs regarding building EDH on a budget.